I had half a mind to ask you about what we might be talking about so I could prepare some thoughts in advance.
I have a few questions that I have prepared that we can go through if you want. Otherwise, we can also just sort of have a casual conversation about, whatever. That might be a good place for us to sort of talk about your practice and, your studio situation. I think about all of those textures and things that you put on something as like hours of care that go into the final read or interpretation or understanding of the object.
Yeah, let's go through the questions, but before we hit those, I want to just kind of circle back around because I think this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and that I think has really been that in many ways changed my studio practice and the way that I approach my own work. And that has to do with the fact that, when we're in school, we find ourselves working for deadlines, right? So,
Yeah.
and everything is driven by semesters, and we typically have, let's say, for example, a class like an intro-level class you're teaching, you probably have 3 projects that they're doing in a given semester. Is that about right?
Hmm.
So, you look at 16 weeks and you think about that 16 weeks divided into 3 projects. And then that's really, you literally have only a couple of weeks that you can really put into um, coming up with an idea that you're excited and interested
Hmm.
in working on that relates to the parameters of the project for the class, sorting out all the details about making material choices, figuring out what processes you might be able to use or will have to learn to support those processes. And, when it comes down to it, the actual execution of the work has to be compressed into such a tight schedule that that you don't often have that benefit of being able to have the kind of reciprocal dialogue with the work that I think is really so important to developing um, really good work, right? So the moment that the sort of epiphany that for me was that I very goal oriented, very driven to output. Always working very hard to produce as much work and the best quality work I could possible. But still, after I got to school, I was very conscious of how much time I was spending on any given particular project. And
How are you saying that you feel like you were in that rhythm that you had developed in school, and then like you felt like you were
that's
working
right.
on that type of a timeline?
Right, because school teaches us how
Yeah.
to exercise our practice, right?
Hmm.
So then when we get out into the real world and we're not in school anymore, we're still very much kind of working in these small blocks of
Yeah.
compressed time, trying to, and because we're having to work for a living. So we have even less time to put in the studio. So
Yeah.
that time that you do put in the studio becomes so much more precious, right?
Yeah.
But you feel this pressure to be, as productive as possible during those times. But um, so so here I am. I'm in like this kind of like high production mode, trying to crank a lot of work out for shows, trying to get as much time into the studio as I can as possible. And at the time, I was also working part-time at the Art Institute, working this is when I first started working as a supervisor in the shops. So I was working evenings in the shops, and I was working during the day teaching at Columbia College in the
Hmm.
foundations program. And my second or third semester, they offered me a artist in residence position. And this is the first time that I had ever been afforded a position like that. And when I got into, and basically the commitment required me to do nothing more but go into the facilities for 8 hours a week and just work on my own work,
Yeah.
right? So all of a sudden I had this gift of this free time to be able to um, further maximize or increase my productivity. And this struck me as like, who wouldn't love that? You're getting paid to make your art now, right?
Hmm.
How often does that happen in the real world? So, I continue with this kind of thinking of like, what can I do to maximize the efficiency of the use of my time and all this? And then came the sort of, lightning strike, which caused me to try to turn the situation around and look at it from a slightly different angle, which was, now that I'm getting paid to do this by somebody else, why don't I take the time that I would not have necessarily been able to afford myself before and unconditionally commit myself to an exercise that I well knew was going to require an inordinate amount of time to arrive at that goal, and go forward with that, practicing my creative practice in that way. And it dramatically changed the way that I thought about what kind of attention my work actually deserved.
Yeah.
And that really got me starting to examine the fundamental characteristics of these materials and try to establish a relationship with them that was based on knowing them intimately, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just understanding their structure mechanically, not just trying to understand like how a tool works with a material, but getting to know who those materials were. What's their personality? Who are they? What are they about? What do they best say? What do they have to say, and what can I learn from them? And that was really the beginning of my sort of, obsession with developing deep personal relationships with the materials that I was working with, to come to better understand what it was that, how I could collaborate with them.
Mm-hmm. In what ways do you see you developing those personal relationships with the materials? Like, what does a collaboration between you and a material look like?
It can vary depending on the material, but the one that I most readily comes to mind is working with the locust thorns,
Mm.
right? So that relationship began as a romance, as many of these relationships often do, where I was fascinated with the beauty and the physical properties of this material. Um, but at the same time, I was also challenged by the fact that these things as an object were so deeply vested with meaning, right? And and I find it to often be the case that things that have deep vested meaning in them can be exceptionally difficult to work with because they carry such a strong language.
Yeah.
And so it's often hard to transcend the cliches of that language. And additionally, the material was, I couldn't find a way to work with it as a material because it was, because of its material properties. They're in many ways they have a lot of material strength,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not highly conducive to mechanical manipulation. So when you try to drill through them, they have a tendency to split. They can't be used with adhesive because they have an extremely slick closed grain that almost has a waxy coating on it that adhesives wouldn't hold to. So they were challenging to find a way to work with in a way that was really maximizing all of these properties or all of these kind of challenges that came along with them.
So you have to adjust your expectations to what the material allows, and then sort of this is where the collaboration comes in, because you can only push the material so far, and then the material at some point in time pushes back. So you have to sort of like give up a little bit of what your desires are and sort of meet the material and what it wants to be a little bit. Is this what you're saying here?
I guess this might sound strange to say, but I think it's very much like the relationships that we develop with people, right? The better we come to understand those individuals, the easier it is for, I think, in many cases, to relate with them, to collaborate with them, and to build a strong relationship. And the benefit of having a, a kind of practice like I have is that I have in many ways had that kind of luxury of having the time to allowing or affording myself the time to get to know these things. And I think another part of this is that the nature of my practice is such that in contrast to what we do in school, where we start a project, work towards a goal of finishing that project, and then start another project. In my practice, I will easily have a half a dozen projects going at the same time. And that really gives me more time to think deeply about how to arrive at the right solution to problems or challenges that come along with those materials. And sometimes it might be a matter of days or weeks or months, or sometimes in the case of the locust thorns, I collected them for years before I ever put them into practice using them in my own work. And so I had those things around me, living with them in a way that while my conscious mind was busy on one project, I believe a part of my subconscious or unconscious was working on solving some of those other problems through my proximity to those things in the space. So, again, maybe it sounds a little bit like crazy talk, but I think that everybody's coming to understand and agree that this unconscious or subconscious aspect of the operations of our mind that are going on in parallel with our conscious activities they represent 75-80% of what's actually going on in our brain at any given time, right? So I am a big believer that maintaining proximity to these things helps facilitate coming to learn and understand those things, even if you're not just staring at them and thinking hard on them.
Mm-hmm. How does these materials or the materiality that you gravitate towards factor into the subject matter that comes through in your work?
I think that it's kind of there's a reciprocal relationship that runs in different directions with sort of different problems or challenges that I'm approaching. So one of them might be that I'm seduced by this beautiful material and I want so badly to use it, but I don't really have an appropriate context to put it into. And the counterpoint to that would be that I've got this idea that I'm really have a very clear understanding of what it is that I want to say or how I want people to respond to this work, but I don't yet know either how I'm going to be able to define that through physical and non-physical space. Sometimes it might, again, these things can sometimes take a very long time for me to work out or sort out. But again, sometimes it can, there can just be a trigger, right? That all of a sudden I see this thing and I make these connections between two things that I never saw a connection between before. And it may have simply resulted from those things suddenly finding themselves in proximity to each other on a workbench or a table. Or it might be something like, I was watching a PBS documentary that was about the poet M.S. Merwin. And I didn't know anything about M.S. Merwin, but somehow the name sounded familiar to me. And then this morning I've been doing these series of poetry readings that I was recording as an exercise or practice to prepare myself for these instructional video tutorials I was going to be doing. So anyway, that point being that to try to practice or exercise working before the camera, I did a series of these poetry readings by Pablo Neruda. And for those that don't know, Neruda wrote in Spanish, and speak Spanish, but it's very difficult for me to appreciate the subtlety of the use of language and poetry reading in Spanish. So I'm reading an English translation of this poem this morning by Neruda, and I look at the bottom of the page where it gives credit to the person that translated that, and it's M.S. Merwin that did the translation. So, it's sometimes it's through this, sometimes it's these revelations or these epiphanies come through coming to understand the connections that exist between things. And I think that even though our awareness or consciousness of these connections can be a really important part of the creative process, I think that we can't underestimate how much work is going on in the background and how much our mind already knows that we're not yet aware of.
And I find often with students that they're like, oh, well, I need to figure out what I'm doing before doing something. And I actually feel like sometimes you just need to do things. And then the random thing that happens to be on your table next to the project you're working on actually ends up becoming your project, but you just didn't know it because you can't predict that sort of stuff, and I think that really does speak to this like idea of collaborating with materials or even tools or processes or something that and I guess also this idea of the sort of unconscious, that there's so much that's happening in and around the moment that we're sort of aware of, and it's an art practice really is actually just being like, okay, this is making space for those accidents to happen often.
Agreed.
Now that we're sort of on like a process sort of thing, what does a typical day in the studio look like for you?
Well, typical day in the studio for me, if we talk about like life before sheltering in place, the typical studio day for me begins before I go to work in the morning. And this is a practice I got into years and years ago. One of the greatest challenges that we have in trying to maintain an active professional working relationship in the studio is just committing the time to first finding the time to do it, and then making that commitment to follow through on spending that time, right? So one of the kind of things that I did to improve the likelihood of me having a more productive working relationship was that before I went to work, I would stop in my studio in the morning and make sure that I sort of went through the motions of setting something up that would be waiting for me there in the evening when I got home from work. That would be the extra incentive. Like, okay, I came in, I organized a few things, even if it just was 10 or 15 minutes of my morning on the way to work, stop in, get some things set up, think about what I was hoping to accomplish that afternoon or evening when I got off of work. And, it's different for everybody, but that seemed to very much help me spend as much time in the studio as I wanted to.
And helps you to be motivated, so when you return from work that you're already sort of like in process on something immediately when you walk into the door or whatever.
That's right. Yeah, we all know that anyone that has lived this experience, which is I think most everybody that has a studio practice outside of their working life, is that when you get off of work, like, it is hard, whatever it is that, whatever it is that you feel that you need to do to make your life right, to go to the gym or to go to the grocery store or to do those errands that you need to do, or to go to your studio to get things done. Anything that you can do to increase the likelihood of that happening is greatly to your benefit. So I started working on strategies to maximize the likelihood of successful outcomes. So, having the studio set up in advance and waiting for me was one thing. The other thing was, and we don't always have the grace of being able to do this, but I would do everything that I could to try to make sure that my studio was in the path in some way between me and my home, right?
Yeah.
So that, you know, because again, it's like if it's in my path, it was increasing the likelihood of me being able to successfully go there and do that instead of going home and getting something to eat or going home and watching the news and then trying to, you know, raise myself up to go back out again and go to the studio. Um, that being said, having the situation that I have now, you know, which is in many ways a dream come true, is, you know, to have a studio in part of the space that I'm living in so that I'm able to easily migrate from one space to the other. And, you know, the beauty of being able to just dash downstairs, you know, in the middle of the night, if, you know, I want to, and be able to look at something again or make a note about something that I should do the next day is, it's an extraordinary privilege.
My studio is only half a block from my house, and I've largely become like a nocturnal artist, where most of my work happens between like 10 p.m. and 2 in the morning. And there's something about people being asleep and me being like isolated in that time that actually allows me to focus. Um, but I really appreciate the ability to, if I'm like about to go to sleep and I have this random idea, that I can very easily get up and go walk over there and just take care of it and figure it out. Do you find that you like some people when they have studios that are in such close proximity actually find it difficult to maintain focus or to be productive like within a home setting because there's so many other potential distractions and things that are there, that it might be difficult to make like a full sort of work day out of it or something because you didn't have a destination to go to? Have you experienced any of that sort of stuff with your at-home studio?
Sounds silly to say this, but there's not a lot that I'd rather do than work in my studio. And um, I've done, I guess I've also done some things to, you know, maximize the likelihood of me having a more enjoyable experience in the studio, by having things around me that are some of the creature comforts that one might enjoy in their home, right? So, like, I brought plants into my studio, which makes it a space that where I can do kind of combine some of the things that I enjoy about home life with that studio space without them being things that would necessarily compromise my ability to be productive. So, you know, like having a television in the studio space would be um, terribly distracting to me. It just wouldn't be something that um, uh, that I have the boundary restrictions to be able to effectively navigate. But having my plants in the studio, or this time of the year, I'm got a lot of seed starters going on to take out into the garden, and so having things like that down here, having some bringing, making sure that I've got something to eat and to drink in the studio, you know, things like that. I guess you know, maybe help ensure that I'm less prone to be distracted or feel the needs or compelled to be in a, you know, in my home.
I was curious also to hear about your relationship between your practice and also your work at SAIC. Like, how does sort of being an educator or continually being in a shop all day change your practice?
Well, I can tell you that, you know, probably the biggest influence that working at the, well, can't say just working at the Art Institute, but working as in a kind of technical support capacity, like I do. As you know, I started out as my first real full-time job out of school was running a woodworking facility and a metalworking facility that also included a foundry. Um, some of the skills I had to be able to, I already had to be able to do the job, and some skills I had to acquire or learn to be able to do the job. But working with and around tools, and not just using those tools, but having to change blades on them, having to repair them, and having to teach other people how to use those tools, I think deeply influenced my thinking, and most certainly also influenced my aesthetic. Um, the 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 aesthetics of the built world is something that has always been a strong influence in my own practice. But when I started having a closer, intimate working relationship with those tools, I think that's when I really started to see the influence of the aesthetics of the way that these things were made and the way that they worked, influencing my own practice.
Mm.
Um, that could be everything from the articulation of hardware to the movement of mechanical parts on those tools.
Mhm.
And so I think that just being in that kind of shop environment was uh, very deeply influential. But probably the thing more than anything else, the benefit of working in an educational environment where we're talking about art all day, where we're helping other people how to learn how to make things, makes us better at doing those things.
Mhm.
So this as I showed people how to do things, I got better at doing those things myself. And as I had to work with students and um, help them work through um, understanding their own practice and understanding their objectives and defining how to go about meeting those goals, I mean, that's like, practice, 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 practice every day. And so, you know, it's been a gold mine for my practice because, again, it's given me the opportunity to take this kind of deep dive into coming to understand um, the properties of these materials. What are their quintessential properties, and then these different ways of being able to take those things and form them into whatever shape or color or what I needed them to be.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things I've always been sort of impressed with your practice is your ability to work in these like little moments between things that like to step into the metal shop it's very likely to encounter you just like tinkering away at something that is working its way slowly percolating over many months or whatever into projects, and that it's not even like dedicated focused work time necessarily always that you have, which maybe you get at your home space, but at school you seem to somehow like continually maintain a drive or a focus or an ability to look into details or to work on something in between the continual sort of interruptions. And I'm curious about how like that sort of having like those little facets of work time or little segments of work time in between has changed the type of work that you make.
It makes me laugh a little bit. So, like once upon a time, I was really into collecting fossils from Lake Michigan, right? And when I was at work, I would often be carrying one of these fossils around in my hand sanding it as I walked around the shops. And I think I did this for almost a year at one point in time, where literally anytime you walked in the shop, you would see me walking around with a piece of sandpaper in one hand and with a small object in the other hand, and just sanding on these things. And someone came up to me after I'd been doing this for about 6 months, and they're like, "Man, have you been working on that all semester?"
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's really an excellent question that you posed, Jeff. And I think about this a lot. I mean, on one level, these things grow out of, some of these things grew out of just like, they were just practical decisions that I made. For example, my job requires me to be aware of my environment at all times, right? So I have to always kind of have my head up and be looking around and see what's going on, not just to make sure that people have a safe, productive working relationship with the facilities, but to make sure that people know that I'm available, right? I'm here, I'm available if you need me. And so early on, I started finding myself doing these kind of tinkering on these little things that weren't an impediment to doing my primary job, but also met this need that I have for being busy. It's like, I need to be busy like the bee. There is, it's like, I have a hard time standing still, and I have this need to kind of have some continual movement going on at any given time, right? So whether that be rocking back and forth in my chair as I'm sitting here like this, or shifting my weight from foot to foot when I'm standing, there's something just about me that requires me to be engaged in some kind of activity or movement when I'm active. And sometimes it's hard to turn off when I'm trying to be inactive.
Uh-huh.
But so this practice of working on these kind of like small little objects was in part to kind of meet that need I had to feel my hands being productive and active. And there was on some level, there was a lot of satisfaction. It's a very simple satisfaction. It's like whittling, right? Whittling was not about, really, it didn't start out as being something that was about making an object. It was about the activity. And when so whittling at its core was taking a stick and taking a knife and simply peeling or cutting off strips off of that piece of wood until there was no wood left, right? And so then what is it about? If the end goal is just, turning this thing into nothingness. And so if it's not about the end result, then it must very much be about the experience of the practice, or that journey of that practice. And what I came to understand is that, it's different for everybody, but for me, if I could engage my hands in an activity like that, it freed my mind up to go to places that it was unable to go otherwise, because otherwise my mind would feel the need to be occupied with solving all the things that I need to think about. Like, what did I forget to do? Like there's that joke, my bed is the place I go to remember what I forgot to do that day, right? So this exercise of the whittling or the repetitive motion freed my mind to go to a place where it could kind of solve problems in the background, right? And that kind of problem solving that was happening in the background seemed to have a greater capacity for answering some of the more challenging questions that I was wrestling with. But again, I wasn't sitting there thinking about the question, but somehow that question was able to be able to engage in a process of processing or dialogue in the background as I'm whittling away, right?
So these are like motifs, I feel like, that you regularly gravitate towards, where you're performing an action on a surface, or thinking about a hardware and how it holds or functions in a certain way. And so I'm curious about how or why that sort of thing continually works its way into your work also. Where does that sort of fascination come from?
There are things about these patterns textures that I'm creating that are part of it is trying to come to better understand what the possibilities of these materials are in terms of being able to reveal what's hidden underneath the skin, right? So take a piece of, you take a piece of sheet metal, for example. So we take, you take it in its most fundamental state. Iron or iron ore is just like a really beautiful material that has, that to me has very seductive properties to it, and that look like it looks exactly like it's supposed to look, right?
Mm.
So when I look at a piece of iron ore, or even when I look at something, let's say I look at a piece of iron ore, it's dug up out of the ground. To me, it looks unconditionally honest and unconditionally representative of what it is, right? So then you take that iron ore and, that's manufactured into pellets, right? And these ore pellets look like little stones. Um, so they still retain some of the fundamental characteristics of their natural state of being as something that appears to be naturally occurring, that has signs and indications of the effects that its environment has had on it, right?
Mhm.
You can see the wear and the tumble marks on it from its contact with other stones or with water. Um, and there's something about it that it feels true, and it feels honest, and it feels real. Um, but now you take that iron ore pellet and you melt it down in a furnace and you crank it out as a sheet of steel, and um, you stripped all of the sort of you stripped all the personality out of it, and turned it into this kind of this literally a blank slate or a blank canvas. And I guess, the challenge for me is to then take that and restore the origins of who it is in some way to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Hmm.
So that through that manipulation that I'm doing, in some ways I'm trying to reflect some of the fundamental characteristics of what it is and what it can be, um, um, but also clearly demonstrate the forces that have been exercised on it, um, in the same way that that water or rain or wear um, is reflected on the surface of a piece of decaying wood or a rusty piece of steel.
Hmm. There's certainly an awareness of this sort of like micro and macro sort of perspective of the object or the material that like I think like you're thinking about iron how it functions, or steel how it functions like as an image, as a consumable product, but then also thinking about it in the terms of like a molecular state. And so like performing these actions is actually changing the ductile properties of the steel, in producing like a sort of tectonics, or like almost like a microgeology or something within that object. And then somehow it seems that like you as an individual get like imbued within that object or in that material through the process of that action. um, yeah, and then so that's where I sort of like get into that territory where they're like signature moves for you, that it's like you wouldn't have to sign your work ever because there's like a texture, there's a hardware component or something that sort of like is inherently connected to your philosophy or something.
I have to tell you that for me it is very much a process of discovery, and I it's only through a kind of reflective reciprocal dialogue with these things that I'm able to develop a better understanding of what they mean to me, and how I can develop a better relationship with them. And it's I think that I'm very grateful for having had the job that I have, um, for as long as I have, because it has been an environment that's really helped facilitate that knowledge and that learning, and given me the opportunity to share that with others. Yeah, do we want to do like a little pan or tour of the
Yeah.
space at all? Or
Yeah, I feel like that'd be great. Yeah.
we'll talk a little bit about how the space is set up down here. So, once upon a time, it was like every kind of Chicago artist's dream was to be able to have a live workspace, right? And there were two big dreams. One was to have a giant loft space that was a raw space that you were able to, uh, have some live space in and some workspace in. And the other kind of, urban dream was to be able to have a two flat where there was a storefront
Mm-hmm.
in the downstairs that you could use as your studio, and that you would have some accommodations upstairs for space to live in. So I've got the latter, which is a corner storefront that was, when the building was originally designed, it was a pharmacy downstairs and it was a doctor's office and residence upstairs. It was built at the turn of the century. I think it was around 1906, and it's in Humboldt Park on a corner. So it's a high visibility space. So the front of the space I have set up is a combination of office space and, I think it would be a stretch of the imagination to call it a gallery, but let's call it a space where I show finished work, right? So as we look at the front windows, you can see that I've got what I'd call just kind of like a little rotating presentation that I do out of these windows off of the two corners that the building occupies. And some of this is stuff that I might have recently been working on. And some of it are things that are project particular that so some work might be finished work, or some work might be work in progress. This time of the year, I also have a portion of that space dedicated to I always have a portion dedicated to plants, but part of that space has been subdivided into growing for our community garden, which is across the street. So I've got all kinds of little plant starters going here that include things like beets and lettuces and soft herbs and kohlrabi. Then I've got in part of that front workspace, I have kind of like a little office area that includes a drafting table. And earlier in our conversation, I was talking to you a little bit about how important I feel that it is to have some of those things around me that I'm working on when I'm working on other things. So even while I'm here at the work desk working on things that are related to developing these videos for online learning, I keep some of the things that are parts of projects that are ongoing projects that I'm working on, like these letters that I've been doing that are, and again, this is a project that I'm working on for a very long time. They've been included in a number of finished work, but these are a series of these handwritten letters that are then rolled, hand-tied, and we'll see some examples when we move in the studio space of how they were used in a number of different pieces. And those are a good example of something that I started out just writing the letters, and I really didn't know how I was going to use those letters. So the idea was the idea came before an understanding of how that idea was going to physically manifest itself. So so here's a series of those letters that are before they're rolled up. So I like keeping those things on the table around me so that as I'm working, they're still sort of, in some way occupying part of my thought process. This is a little whiteboard setup I've got for some of those instructional authorizations I was doing. And, also when you were talking earlier about me working in the metal shop, and I think a lot of what students see me working on in the shops is things that are made out of metal, because that's kind of like what my job is. But when you actually look at my practice, you find that there's really there's a lot more woodworking and working with other natural materials and breaking them down into small components than there is metalwork in my own practice. So as we walk back into the second part of the space, which is closed off by a set of curtains so I can have them open for public events, or I can have them closed off if I want more privacy, is a space where I have some finished work that's up on the walls. Some of this work is part of my own studio practice, and some of this work is byproducts of commissions that I've worked on. And so there was a big commission that I did for Neiman Marcus some years ago. And so some of the things on these walls are some of the prototypes or studies that I did for that particular project. And then there are sort of piles of things that, again, older work that I just enjoy having around me, because I feel like I'm still learning for those things and coming to understand more about why I'm so interested or obsessed with these things. Some of the areas are dedicated to storing material references, because a lot of the textures and patterns that, as I said earlier, a lot of the textures or patterns that I'm developing on the surfaces of these materials are informed by naturally occurring surfaces and textures that are found, that are a product of the forces of nature acting on them. So there's everything in here from old billiard balls to teeth and feathers and old tools that have worn surfaces on them. And it doesn't interest me that they're worn from being old. It interests me that in that wear you can see the presence of the individual that was using these tools. Okay? Anytime you have a limited amount of studio space, I found it's usually advantageous to be able to shift that space to work with different types of materials. So I have a series of these kind of cart setups that are in the space that are dedicated to different processes. So one cart is set up with finishing products and dyes. One product is set up with soft materials like felt and leather and rubber. One cart is set up with one side of it dedicated to wax work for casting. Some of the carts are dedicated to storing materials that I'm working with. Some of the space is set up for recreational purposes, like I do archery in my studio space as well. And I also feel like, that's one of those things we were talking before about, like not being distracted by the home life. Like I'm less compelled to want to run upstairs, and let's say that I'm kind of at a standstill in terms of what I'm doing with a particular project, or I hit a mental block or something, then I just, ping out a couple dozen arrows. And then again, that activity of doing something that like whittling or like archery sort of frees my mind up and clears my mind up to be able to sort of reset, or to take me around to a different place where I can be more productive. Let's see, this is one of the setups for a lecture that I'm going to be doing that is on cutting glass and drilling holes in glass using hand tools. So that's going to be one of the next lectures. And again, I love to have collections. There is something about collecting things and organizing them that I find deeply satisfying. And so these collections need to have some sort of connection to my interests and activities that I do. So the glass thing has to do with the fact that I used to teach glass blowing. right? And I'm very passionate about glass as a material, and I like working with glass. I like its properties. It's kind of like a magical material. So hence came the collection of the glass cutters. And then you had sort of talked a little bit about my interest in skateboarding. And, I grew up very passionate about skateboarding and grew up at a time when skateboarding went through a real technological innovation in terms of the not just the design of skateboards, but the introduction of things like urethane wheels. For those that aren't old enough to know, once upon a time, wheels were made out of what they called clay, which is more like stoneware or concrete wheels. And before that, wheels were made out of steel. So I'm still very passionate about skateboarding. And at one point in time, I did some workshops at school that were about making skateboard decks out of aluminum. This is kind of like my main workbench in the studio. Again, I love to sort of like organize things. So I like organizational systems like toolboxes. I had just finished a video tutorial on measuring and marking systems. So I went in and organized all the drawers in a machinist cabinet I had to house all the measuring and marking tools that I had. So and at the very back half of the space, we're not going to go into the back third of the space. But in the back third of the space, there's a guest room and includes things like sink and bathroom and shower and things like that. Oh, there's also a 1,700 square foot basement underneath me filled full of all kinds of treasures, including materials and tool resources that I don't have enough space on the first floor for.
Mm-hmm. You talked about these two dreams of like the loft space and the storefront space, and I feel like there's also a third dream of the sort of like studio gallery sort of space. And so do you try to work out events or things like that, or have you done that sort of thing in the past?
That's a relationship that's evolved and changed for me as well. It's like the getting the work out there, sharing it with a larger audience. That was a huge imperative for me when I first started my practice. And again, that's kind of evolved and changed. The big dream to have a space to be able to show your work off and to be able to have public events is something that I'm less interested in now than I was once upon a time. And I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of consideration that's gone into who my audience is, right? I mean, I think that's a hard question to answer for any artist. And that is, who do we want our audience to be? What is the audience that is most meaningful to us? And so I guess the short of it is that I very rarely open my studio up to anyone other than colleagues anymore. I love the idea that I'm able to share my windows and let people have a window into that work that I'm doing. I feel very passionate about that. But I feel less compelled or passionate about creating public events and bringing people together around my own work. It just, it's just not something that I'm that interested in anymore. But at the same time, I feel a great sense of kind of obligation to at least do that in some ways. So every once in a while, I will participate in neighborhood events. Like there's a California Corridor Business Association that host events a couple times a year. And I'll usually sign up to have my studio included on the map of places that are open to the public. I do occasionally get people coming through in the neighborhood that will knock on my door and come in and visit, and I'm more than happy to talk to people about what it is that I'm doing. or what it is that I'm working on, and to get to know new people that way, and to share a little bit about what I'm doing. But the both the subject of my work and my desire to share that work with other people has, to a large degree, has become much more of a personal act to me and less of a public act.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Well, thank you. We can wrap it up here unless you have any parting words of wisdom or anything that you'd like to add. Otherwise, yeah, thank you very much for taking the time. It's greatly appreciated.
Well, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate, and I look forward to getting some feedback and seeing what you come up with.
Okay.
Thank you, Jack.